as I said, the first panel is focusing on the genocide. I'm going to give the floor to our two speakers. But before that, I wanted to speak about we shed a light about the current situation in Darfur. This is a day, it's really important for us to come together to commemorate and recognize the dignity of the victims of genocide, not only in Darfur, but around the globe. So many people have been suffered and have been killed and singled out to be eliminated or exterminated from Armenia, Holocaust, Rwanda, Bosnia, the Yazidi situation, Darfur, Burma, and so many other places. And it is really challenging, and also it is striking that our international community, it is easy for them to come together to commemorate. But to me, it is important that we commemorate, remember those who lost their life. But it is really crucial and most important to the best recognition for the dignity of the victims is to do justice for them, to restore their dignity. And that's what's important. And that is what we are today about, to speak about the situation, but also remind the international community that there is a lot of work needs to be done. And therefore is unfortunately, the best and the worst example of the international community's failure to address. In brief, today, therefore, the genocide in Darfur is entering into its 18th year. Since 2003, millions of people have been driven out of their homes, killing, pillaging, burning of the villages, a destruction of food and water, forcing people in horrible condition in makeshift camps, and they are still under attack. Rape has been systematically used as a weapon of war in Darfur. There has been some effort done by the international community, including the referral of the case. But as of today, we still have the top officials who are responsible of the crimes of genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity in Darfur are still at large and have yet to face trial or face accountability for crimes that they have committed. But not that, the victims are still living out of their homes and they cannot return home because of lack of protection, safety and security, and for fear of being attacked again and again. Even though recently there has been development in Sudan, and the dictator, the genocidal criminal, the ex-president al-Bashir has been removed in April of 2019. And everyone was so happy that now Sudan has the opportunity to move forward. We have an interim government and we have an interim constitution that did nothing but provided immunity for leaders. Throughout their time, the constitution stated that throughout these leaders who are currently in the Sovereign Council and in the cabinet of ministers, no matter what happens, they cannot be held accountable. And that is a big problem for the people of Darfur and many other Sudanese who have suffered throughout the 30 years of the dictator, the totalitarian regime of Omar al-Bashir, and all the crimes and the gross human rights violations that they have been committing. Despite the removal of Bashir and the current interim government, there is no political will to pursue justice or provide protection for the people of Darfur. And the existence of our people in the camp today is a testament to lack of political will. And unfortunately, it is not only the interim government of Sudan is failing, but also the international community. Right now, they are celebrating and racing to establish relations with the interim government of Sudan, and they are misleading and misinforming, spreading misinformation that Sudan now has a democratic government. The government is not democratic. This is a government that when people rose against the regime, they protested and demanded the removal of al-Bashir. They demanded a civilian government. When al-Bashir was removed, the generals, they jumped in and negotiated with the civilian part of the opposition. And then right now, for the fact, Sudan is controlled by two generals who have been a close associate of President al-Bashir and who are the one who implemented the plan and the strategy of exterminating the people of Darfur, forcing these people out of their home, are the two General Al-Burhan and Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo, known as Hemeti today. And that's the challenge that right now the people of Darfur are living. People cannot talk about genocide. People cannot talk about accountability, but also people are not hopeful or having any confidence that anytime soon that there will be peace or justice for the people of Darfur and other areas in Sudan that they have been impacted, and this the current government have been part of it. So this is the situation that currently we are dealing with in the Sudan. I will stop here. Just wanted to shed a light and look at the reality on the ground today in Sudan. And now we'll give the floor to our speakers. Dr. Mukesh Kapila has been is our first speaker, and Dr. Mukesh Kapila, I've never sort of you and I will come back in 2020 to talk about the genocide in Darfur, but unfortunately here we are talking again. But Dr. Mukesh was in Darfur when the genocide started, and he is a witness and also the whistleblower in the Darfur genocide because of his voice in part of speaking up. Maybe some of those people who survive have been have been saved because of speaking up. Otherwise, our people would have been killed in silence when Mukesh was the UN president in Darfur. So, without further ado, Dr. Mukesh, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Niemat. And I thought, according to the program, Greg was going to speak first. Have you changed the order?
Oh, you should, Mukesh. I mean, let's face it, you were the UN's representative in Sudan. I think that's very good. So let's please hear from you.
Well, I don't know. UN representative should always be last. The people should be first. Anyway, I think I find myself in this spot. So, well, I think, yes. So here we are, nearly 2 decades have passed, almost. It's going to be like that. And but what I witnessed in Darfur is as fresh in my mind as if it was today. And because there are certain sights and smells and that leave such a mark on you that they are burned into your soul, as opposed to just your memories, and those things cannot be expunged. I think I'm not going to speak about that, though. However, you're all familiar with that. Let me address this topic today, which is about accountability and justice, as today is the International Day for Dignity and Commemoration of Victims of Genocide, and make a few what I hope will be slightly provocative remarks, but they're intended in a respectful manner. Firstly, have we prevented any genocides in history? I mean, I was thinking about this as I think about it every day, and I'm hard pressed to actually come across examples of genocides prevented. And I stand to be corrected, and I would love to be corrected on that particular point. And it seems to me the reason for that is that these extreme acts of mass atrocity seem to be hardwired into the human condition. I mean, there's all these psycho-evolutionary theories as to why suddenly people gang up on other people. And then, of course, we rationalize them with talk about hate speech and other risk factors, which are well documented by scholars like the Genocide Watch and so on. But I really think it's very important as we commemorate and remember genocide, genocides past, we are quite humble about it. However, that doesn't stop us from laboring away at this particular task. Even if we may not be able to do primary prevention of genocide, there is a lot that can be done through secondary prevention. By that I mean mitigating the effects of genocide. You know, in my case, when I saw what was going on in 2003, 2004, especially the first part of 2004, it was clear that it was, one could just have to pick up the pieces and try and bring some kind of sense to the narrative before the narrative itself got lost. Because you know that what happens in these kinds of situations is that the perpetrators are the ones that airbrush history in a way that suits their purposes, the revisionist approach. So truth is one of the first casualties that is lost in that process. So when we talk about prevention, it's extremely important that everything is done to be able to capture the experiences of what happens during a genocide, even if you are unable to prevent it, even as you're watching as it happened, as I was. And I described it, on some interview I gave to Christian Manapur many years ago, when I said that being in Darfur at the time was like being in a horror movie, where you were literally watching, the train hurtling over the cliff, and you were kind of just there, even though you were trying very hard to, pull the alarm bell and to stop, put your brakes on the engine or whatever in your modest ways. But it is like a horror that has to be witnessed. I say all this because we cannot talk about justice and accountability if records are not kept. So what happened in my case was that within about a month of leaving Sudan, the UN said that all the server containing my archives, my emails, my key documents, my mission reports, photographs from the field, and all the evidence collected by my own visits to Darfur and that of my team, they had been wiped clean after I left Sudan. And even though they were copied to, we living in the email age, even in early 2000s, we were living in the email age. So you could see that those who wish to bring about accountability and justice would have a very hard time actually getting the evidence together, because the evidence is lost, hidden, corrupted, and otherwise the quality of that evidence gets degraded in time. So that would be my kind of a recommendation, that we should make sure things are properly documented. The problem is that when you're living in history yourself, you don't actually know that you're living in a moment in history. Because I think unless you're an extremely arrogant person, you don't think that you're actually doing anything other than your job. It's only in retrospect, when events have happened and they've settled in their proper place in history, you realize, oh my God, I was actually living in history and actually in the middle of it. Good or bad history is another question. And it's only then you realize, oh my God, I wish I had done that. I wish I recorded that. I wish I had documented all of that. So that's one thing I would say. The other thing I would say about genocide in terms of accountability and justice is that it's a very curious thing, that while global frameworks have advanced a great deal since the Genocide Convention of the 1940s, we have many, many new human rights instruments. We have global norms and standards have improved. We have lots of groups the UN has a whole army of officials, special advisors, and all sorts of officials that are engaged in this issue. There are mechanisms for reporting. There are, the Security Council, you have to report to the Security Council from time to time. And, when the Security Council says the Security Council stays seized with the matter, I often used to joke and say it's seized up by the matter rather than seized by the matter. But, frivolity aside, on a serious issue, the point is a lot has happened in the last 60, 70 years in terms of building up the norms and frameworks, the mechanisms and tools. And in that time, of course, there's much more interconnectivity. So in a way, we're in a very different place than we were in 1946. That's the good side. Having said all that, the gap that I see at the heart of this protecting the dignity of the victims and bringing justice and accountability is the big gap between the macro and the micro level. So it's one thing, and I'm delighted that the International Criminal Court finally acted. It acted actually quite fast, thanks to the work of all sorts of people who would not let this matter go in the 2000s. And it's good that the leaders are under indictment, and some of the perpetrators are actually under arrest, and Bashir is also under arrest, and hopefully he might be transferred to The Hague one of these days, or some judicial process will take place that will be of at least the same standard as the International Criminal Court standard, though I think he should really appear in front of the International Criminal Court in some form. All that is good stuff, right? But the issue of justice is about what happens to those who suffered and the perpetrators and the victims. And I prefer the word survivors rather than victims, but it is true. There are also victims. And some of the victims, their suffering over time continues to be, in a sense, enhanced, so that they were not just victims once, they continue to become victims. And I saw that for myself when I visited Chad 10 years later. And I was thrown out of Chad when the government of Chad realized they wouldn't allow me to visit the refugee camps, which I was sneaking in to go and see. But nevertheless, if I couldn't get to the refugees in the eastern Chad, the refugees came to see me, and we documented quite a lot of what was going on to the Darfuri diaspora in Chad. And many children were born, a whole generation was born, in fact. But they were the secondary victims in a sense. So I think in the second panel, I hope we'll hear more about how do we ensure that there is a connection between the macro level justice, if you like, the prosecuting the big policymakers and leaders who give the orders and direct the crimes against humanity, and that is obviously the right thing to do. But the job isn't done unless the justice is also brought at the level of the perpetrator and the victim and the survivor. And this came home to me very much when I remember visiting Rwanda nearly 20 years after the '94 genocide. I couldn't return to Rwanda for nearly 20 years because I was so traumatized by it. But finally, the Rwandan government said, "You have got to come and see. We have moved on." So I went, and I went to all the same places that I had seen during the bloody days of 1994. And by then, the bodies were all bones in the memorials. But thanks to no thanks to my medical knowledge, I could, in walking through the memorials and seeing skeleton after skeleton after skeleton, one could easily tell that each of the hundreds of thousands of deaths, and in that particular memorial, there were at least 70,000 skeletons. Each of those deaths was an individual one. And I could tell that person had died because the skull had been bashed in. And that person had been smoked in a hole, because you could tell that from what was left of the bones. And that person had a sharp injury. And that person had that thing committed. So we may talk about mass atrocities, And sometimes the word mass and vast statistics have a numbing effect, because each of these acts of killing, even though they might be part of mass acts, they're individual acts. And each person dies in an individual way. And so therefore, I would say that the next phase of development of accountability mechanisms and bringing justice, and also is to really try and not deal in abstract frameworks alone, even if the frameworks are implemented, the perpetrators caught and brought to justice, and that's good. But how do we actually bring popular justice or common justice or justice to individuals? And the reason this is important in prevention terms, which is the theme of this panel, is because in the end, if you look at history, and Greg will tell us more perhaps, is that when a genocide happens and when mass atrocity happens, it is not the first time or the last time. So in Rwanda, for example, as I discovered in my own researches and my own experiences in Rwanda, which was before I found myself in Darfur, was the genocide, little mini genocides or practice genocides had been committed in Rwanda in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, 80s, before the big one in the 90s. And if you look at the story of mass atrocities in Sudan, including genocidal crimes in Darfur and the other atrocities, Ahmadi genocide, in my view, in the Nuba Mountains and elsewhere, you realize the sequence and cycle of events of at least 20, 30 years, if not 40 years, that preceded the events of 2002, 3, 4 that we're talking about in terms of what we recognize as the modern Darfur genocide. So what that means is that connecting all those things is important, because if individual justice is not done, what happens is the myth is laid for the perpetuation of hate and horror, and then things get repeated again and again. Either you go into denial, which is what happened in the case of Armenia and Turkey, and between Armenia and the Ottoman Empire. I think as long as Armenian denial carries on, then I think we can have little peace in that region, however it's dressed in the modern way. So let me kind of conclude here by saying that it's not about, I'm not giving you a lecture on genocide, all of you know everything about it, but more in terms of saying that the job is not done. That while advocacy has achieved a great deal, and while rules and norms have expanded, and while there is much greater public consciousness, and while I think things are heading in the right direction, and I'm an optimist, you have to be, I do feel that there are critical gaps, which unless they're addressed, they lure us into this false sense of complacency. And I believe we are in that false sense of complacency. And that also brings me to something else, and that is, I mean, as I say, I've been dealing with COVID in recent months professionally. And the slogan in COVID is, no one is safe until all are safe. That's the kind of slogan we have. And this is why everyone is fixated at the moment on access to vaccines wherever you are in the world. Well, I'm afraid the same is true in our business here. And that is to say, if we are not consistent in our response to atrocities around the world, then I think these things will carry on happening. Because when they happen in one place, they are a connection to it happening elsewhere as well. And unfortunately, our responses at the moment are quite selective. They depend on media attention, they depend on celebrity attention, or they depend on moment in time when something is more fashionable. But as we are sitting here today, we have the Uyghurs in China, we have the Rohingyas, we have many other situations around the world, and of course, situation in Sudan is by no means, the chapter is by no means closed at all. So how do we bring about consistency in our approach? And that has something to say, that has some implications for the practical agenda for organizations like Darfur Women's Action Group as we move forward. So let me conclude here to say that the glass is half full, but very definitely it is also half empty. And the greatest worry is that we're lulled into a sense of complacency about whatever modest gains have been made. And actually, we might find that they are not as substantive as we think they are. So we have to keep on struggling. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kapila. Indeed, complicity, unless it is stopped from our world leaders, and unless we have consistency, keeping the narrative, and of course, and indeed, the job has not been done. We cannot agree with you more, and thank you for your powerful presentation. It's a strong reminder for all of us and for our audience. I would like now to give the floor to our Dr. Greg Stanton. The floor is yours, Dr. Greg. Okay.
Thank you very much, Niemat. You must know, by the way, that for me, Niemat Ahmadi is a hero. I should like to nominate her for a Nobel Peace Prize someday, and I really think she would deserve it. Her work on the genocide in Sudan has been nonstop, without any flagging of energy, and visionary. And I would follow her into hell and back, I can tell you. She is an amazing leader. I want to talk a little bit about why we still have genocide. There really wasn't a anti-genocide movement before there were one of genocide. There were Holocaust museums, and of course there were some very important human rights organizations like Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch and so forth, but there wasn't an anti-genocide movement. When I left the State Department in 1999, I realized, having worked to create the Rwandan Criminal Tribunal and also the Cambodian Tribunal, that we also needed a mass movement. We needed a mass movement. And so, since there wasn't one, we founded Genocide Watch and the Alliance Against Genocide. What has interestingly happened since COVID came is that because of virtual communications and what we have discovered from them, Genocide Watch and the Alliance have thrived rather than been crushed by this terrible pandemic. We now have more members in the Alliance member organizations than we ever had before, and Genocide Watch has grown in its volunteer staff, all are volunteers, to 27 staff members. Now that is perhaps, it doesn't sound very significant, but when you look at the Alliance, which now has over 75 member organizations, including some big ones, like the International Crisis Group, Minority Rights Group, Survival International, a whole number of really important groups, you see we've made some progress. Because the need we have is not to organize another pyramid, another hierarchical organization. It is to organize a network of anti-genocide organizations. The Alliance has 4 goals: genocide education, early warning, rapid response, and I say response not by military forms necessarily, but by diplomacy, UN, and regional diplomacy, and creation of, and finally 4th, creation of courts and effective punishment of genocide. We've made some progress. Genocide education has become part of the school curricula in many states and countries, and genocide studies have grown in universities. More policymakers know about the risk factors and processes to develop into genocide. More journalists inform the public about early warning signs of genocide, and there's much more news coverage of massacres. And there have been several, I believe, successful genocide preventions. Kosovo, East Timor, Macedonia, Sierra Leone, Liberia, Cote d'Ivoire, Kenya, Burundi. I think all of those are cases where, even though sometimes massacres had already begun, they were stopped. And where, in fact, genocide, much worse genocide, was prevented. So, and finally, we have, of course, convicted a number of genocidists and war criminals in international tribunals, in the ICTR, the ICTY, the Sierra Leone Tribunal, the East Timor Tribunal, the Commemorates Tribunal. We have a very distinguished prosecutor from a couple of those tribunals, Steve Rapp, who not only prosecuted in Sierra Leone, but also at the ICTR. And of course, now we have the International Criminal Court. But there have also been a lot of failures, and that is what Mukesh was getting at. We know what those failures are. They're right in front of us every day. Darfur, South Sudan, Democratic Republic of Congo, Yemen, Myanmar, Nigeria, Korea, North Korea, China. I mean, you could go on, as you know. So the question is, what leads to success? The first is a united UN Security Council or a regional organization. NATO is one in Kosovo and Macedonia. ASEAN was in East Timor. That can be a move towards success. Peacekeeping by a national or regional force. France did that in Cote d'Ivoire. Nigeria did it and ECOWAS did it in Sierra Leone and Liberia. Popular opposition to ethnic violence. This is crucial. This is what we really need to focus on. And that is what did it in Macedonia and Kenya. Political compromise between ethnic leaders also has been crucial in both of those countries, Macedonia and Kenya. In other words, I think now we are in an era when genocide prevention must be refocused on local prevention and national prevention. In other words, it needs to move inside countries. And that has been what is so hopeful about what has happened in Sudan, in spite of the fact that Sudan, it continues to be basically run by a lot of the same people. What has happened, however, has been there's a recognition that something is deeply wrong in Sudan and it needs to be reformed. So we need to support continuing change in Sudan that will buttress the anti-genocide movement there. I would like to see creation, for instance, of an Office for Genocide Prevention in Sudan, staffed by Sudanese. It can be advised by, people from all over the world, but nevertheless, it needs to be Sudanese. And I secondly believe that we need to support the journalists of Sudan. We need to protect them against the murderers who are after them. We also need to build the strength of the court system in Sudan so that it can actually put people on trial who commit the assassinations and murders that continue in Sudan. And we need to allow people who have been displaced from their homes in Darfur and in other parts of Sudan to return to their homes with adequate protection. Now, all of those are big, they're difficult, but we need to have a long-term objective here because the anti-genocide movement is a long-term movement. We aren't just trying to achieve a regime change. We're trying to achieve a whole culture change. And that is what I believe is possible. I've seen it happen. I was part of the independence movement in Ukraine. I was leader of advisor. And I watched a cultural change in that country that literally overthrew the Soviet Union. In those days, nobody thought the Soviet Union could fall, but it did. This is the way we can operate because that was a movement inside. Don't ever let a foreign leader tell you that he was the solution that he brought down the Soviet Union. It was the people in the Soviet Union who brought it down. And that is why I believe that there is a lot of hope in Sudan, because what we saw was a very strong democratic movement in Sudan that actually toppled a government, that put Bashir in jail, that has now sent Ali Khashoggi and others to the ICC for trial. And I think, in other words, that this can continue in Sudan. What does this mean, however? It means that the great powers, like the Soviet Union, like Russia, the United States, Canada, UK, France, Germany, all of these great powers need to refocus their foreign policies on prevention of genocide and human rights. Can you imagine what it would be if we had a foreign policy in the United States that was largely determined by human rights, the human rights of the people in the countries where we have representation? I know that's a really radical idea. I mean, I remember bringing it up in the United States State Department when I was in there, and they said, "Oh, great, really? Let's be realistic." That is the word. It's realism versus a idealistic, if you will, human rights orientation. Well, I do not believe that an idealistic human rights orientation is at all unrealistic. If we were to support the human rights of people around the world, I believe we would have a much more successful foreign policy. And I believe, in fact, that is the long-term policy that we should be supporting in every country. What can we do here, and what can we do in other ways to support all of this? Well, first of all, I believe we need to make genocide education part of the curriculum in every secondary school in the world. Secondly, I think we need to have a cooperative, voluntary, worldwide alliance or mass movement of NGOs to pressure governments to take the needed action to prevent and stop genocide. When you look at the history of major changes in the world, the anti-slavery movement, the women's liberation movement, these incredibly important revolutionary movements, you realize that it took the voluntary work of literally thousands and millions of people to make them happen. And that is what we must organize, we must support, we must make possible. I believe this leadership of this alliance has to be cooperative and international rather than centralized and hierarchical. I think we will need a lot of money. We're going to need another George Soros. What about Jeff Bezos? I'd like to talk to Jeff about empowering the anti-genocide movement. How about a few $100 million just to start off? And I don't say that because I'm, interested in any money for myself. Genocide Watch has spent a total of $100,000 over 20 years, $5,000 a year. It doesn't take a lot of money, really, but it does take the kind of money that is behind Human Rights Watch, Amnesty, and these other very successful human rights organizations. We need a mass movement that has membership. Amnesty International is a very good example of how that should be done. We should make, and sounds, I know Steve is going to be amused at this, we should be recruiting and mobilizing government policymakers into this anti-genocide movement. We have a lot of friends inside the governments of the world. And simply, keeping in contact with them, developing a network that includes them could be hugely helpful to this movement. I know because when I was in the State Department, I found a lot of people who were on the side that I thought we should be on against genocide. We should be trading Genocide educated university students, and we should encourage them to enter foreign policy making in governments, regional organizations, and the UN. We should infiltrate the foreign policy establishment. I know that sounds like an interesting idea, doesn't it? We should educate political leaders about the importance of genocide prevention, and we should demand that they be involved in that effort. I was so dismayed by this last campaign here in the United States, where genocide prevention was not mentioned by either candidate. I think, and that isn't the first time. In the Bush versus Gore election, it also wasn't. So this is a pattern in our elections. We should be making that a major part of our goals. So that is my strategy, if you will. Some people have accused me of just wanting to take over the world. Yeah, I think that's a good idea, actually. I think we should. But I do think that, and this comes out of my own experience in the human rights movement. We should personalize every appeal. Tell people that preventing genocide is about protecting particular people. Name them. Introduce them. Because we're in this struggle for love. Avoid humanitarian narcissism. We're not in this struggle for ourselves, for our own fame, for our own fortunes. We're in it for the future of the human race. Now, I believe this is a spiritual as well as material struggle, because those who ignore the spiritual nature of human beings are ignoring what knits us together as a human race. I believe that we're working with the force that created the universe and made every person. We're channels for that force. So I'll leave you with, some have called it a benediction that I sometimes end what I say with, but I believe it very deeply. Love is more powerful than evil. Love is God's force personally expressed. Justice is stronger than genocide. Justice is God's force socially expressed. And we should never lose faith that we'll win this struggle, because faith gives substance to things hoped for, and hope is the assurance that life will triumph over death. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gray. Indeed, we will never lose hope, and that's why we are here. It gives us a hope when we all come together and talk, and also it gives me great hope to know that you all are, every time we call on you, you come, and on your own way as individuals and groups, you have not ceased working on these issues, even on behalf of people that you have not seen, them, you have not heard, and that's inspiring to many people who may look at the situation, it looks gloomy, and they feel discouraged. But you have been inspiring so many people, and particularly the affected communities, people that you come to the symposium, you meet them, and guess what? Today we have people from inside the Sudan, and probably some from internally displaced camps who are watching this, and we have people from all over the world. So you are motivating so many people to continue to commit to this cause just by seeing you all being around here, and you have been working for all of these years, and you have not discouraged, you have not lost hope. That's a testament to the commitment, and also the hope that we continue to hold, that one day we'll see a world without a genocide. Before we close our panel, I think we have several questions that were sent by our audience in advance for both panels. So I have for our panel right now, for both of you, and feel free to answer as you like. The first question is that what are the most effective and pragmatic ways to elicit attention from our new administration? And the same question is also how we can ensure that the view of this of the married other important issues, like how we can keep the administration, how to draw their attention and how to keep them engaged when there are so many other domestic issues in their plate. That's the question number one. The question two is how has COVID affected genocide prevention effort, and how will it affect the future of genocide prevention? Um, the third question is also what are ways for viewers and supporters to get involved? Um, I think we have a lot more questions. So I will, if I'm going fast, please remind me. What are strategies to ensure women's voices are included and prioritized in the genocide prevention effort? The fifth question is, do you think middle and high schools should be teaching art history more like the genocide in Darfur, and what are the ways you could recommend teachers might do that? The last question is question number 6. Is there a comparative venture in place to coordinate documentary or documentary archives such as the Darfur Documentation Center in the Switzerland and the National Archive, the UNAU records, resources assembled by those who work with Sheriff Bosnian. Oh, Bosnian. Sorry. So these are like questions, and I also expect that our audience send other questions, but we first will go ahead and we'll give our speakers the opportunity to answer this question. And for the question that coming from the Facebook Live, we will go into the next panel, and then at the end, if we answer the questions and we have more time left, we will take more questions from the ones that came from Facebook Live, and if not, then we can then send those answers in written or repost them on Facebook for our audience. So Dr. Craig and Dr. Mukesh, feel free to take any of the questions that you may like to answer.
Mukesh, let's divide them in half. Well, every other question, okay? So I'll take the U.S. question about how do we affect Biden. That's obviously a U.S. question.
Very much so.
You take the one about COVID and how it is affected. And I'll take the one, well, we'll just keep going. You know, my view on how to affect policymakers is personal. I believe you need to really establish personal relationships. That is how we work at Genocide Watch. You will usually won't hear our name, you know, behind any given policy. And we never try to take credit either, because we aren't the ones who make the decisions. All we can do is go in and talk to people, and then they make the decisions. They should get the credit. So that is what I would say. We need to quickly establish relationships with new office holders in the new Biden administration, and that includes in the State Department and the Defense Department and the NSC and elsewhere. And I think we can do that. I mean, we were really successful even in this past administration. I mean, Bob Destro is a good friend of mine. and he was Assistant Secretary of State for Human Rights. So, you know, this is really a bipartisan anti-genocide movement, and we should keep it that. So, Mukesh, take up the COVID question.
Right. If I could just, as a non-American, say a sentence on influencing the new American administration, great. I very much hope you will do so. Though it's very obvious that the United States remains, sadly, a very divided country. But having said that, can I just have a plea as a non-American that for Americans to stop using words like American leadership?
Oh,
I can tell you, at least living in Europe and elsewhere, we want American partnership. We do not wish for American leadership. Today, we're gone are the days when one had to turn towards Uncle Sam to kind of show the way. And the arrogance that comes out of America, and I see this already in some of the rhetoric from Biden appointees about how they're going to kind of somehow, you know, push up the leadership back again to where it should be. Yes, please, a partnership, but not leadership. And we all need to be leaders. I think on the COVID question, well, 2 points really. First is that COVID has been totally disastrous for everything, in the sense that, unfortunately, the world's bandwidth has been so consumed by COVID, unjustifiably, in my opinion. But nevertheless, that's happened, is that every other subject under the sun has taken a second place in it. So, and I think the sooner we kind of get back to not necessarily normal, but a new normal, I hope a better normal, but more to about attending to other matters, including the matters that we are talking about. Having said that, the flip side of COVID has been that, dictators of all sorts, authoritarian regimes all over the world have used the COVID to actually to infringe human rights in the name of infection control. And we see that in every country, virtually every country. And certainly in serious cases include, for example, the neighbor to Sudan in Ethiopia, where elections were abandoned because of COVID, or in Hong Kong, where local elections didn't go ahead, and you know what's happening there, and so on and so forth, if you like to. It's extremely important that the COVID excuse is not used in terms of trying to get back to some of the norms and human rights values that need to be promoted around the world.
So then there were two other questions. One is about how people should get involved. Why don't you take that one, Mukesh? And there's another one about women's voices. How can we deal with that? Because that is something dear to my heart. I know it's dear to yours as well.
Yeah. I mean, I wish I had a kind of clever answer. If there was a clever answer to these questions, then you would have found them by now. But a couple of points really, orientations. The first thing is, and this I have learned after my own experiences of last decades, and that is that the best way to get involved with anyone is to help people in need. You know, where I've had little time for genocide-related advocacy previously was when people spouted slogans and ranted and raved on the streets. But actually, when you ask them to do anything practical, in sense of relieving the suffering of people on the ground, they said, oh, well, that's the job of the humanitarian organizations. I know that Niemat and her team actually do a lot, and for some reason she doesn't talk too much about that because she's quite modest in Syria. But it's the humanitarian support actions that keep people hopeful, resilient, alive, and also kind of questioning and challenging that really matter. So I think if people simply want to get involved by shouting slogans and tweeting and all that sort of pointless activities without any action, which helps people, then I think please don't waste up precious bandwidth. So I'm actually a great proponent of the new humanitarianism. And here I have to just pause a minute, that there's a divide here. That and I'm the person who's worked in the Red Cross and many other organizations. There's one line of thinking which says, well, as humanitarians, you hear no evil, you see no evil, you do no evil, hopefully, and all you do is just apply the elastoplast, okay? And the other branch of humanitarianism is that it requires people to actually raise their voices, to challenge the causes of problems rather than tackling the symptoms. It doesn't matter who you are as a person. Whatever you are, just practically muck in and to help people. That's what I would say. So I think as far as the role of women's voice is concerned, well, I think with Darfur Women's Action Group, we have an excellent kind of leadership here. So I would say everyone should join you. And obviously, I think I would also say to you, Niemat, as I've got you as a captive audience, is I know your name is Darfur Women's Action Group, and I think that's your focus, and that's good. And I think having a focused organization is also good. But I think you've now got enough reputation, enough background, enough experience to kind of branch out. I mean, you can retain the name Darfur Women's Action Group, but let's turn Darfur as a symbol of action and not just geographical place called Darfur in a place called Sudan. So Darfur becomes then a symbolic thing. Symbolic doesn't mean unpractical. As I was saying earlier on, we need practical action as well, you see. So that's what I would say. I know that some years ago, we were in Iraq and so on, but and this goes back to my point about consistency. It's no good fighting for accountability and justice in one place and turning your closing your eyes to something else somewhere else. So I think that consistency is absolutely vital, and that's where I would say people can also get involved.
I would just make one comment about the women's voices, because I'm convinced women's voices are going to be the most important way in which we finally end genocide and end war. I believe men and women have different ways of dealing with conflict. And I mean, I like to say, when men have conflict, they fight. When women have conflict, they talk. And speaking as a person who has been a diplomat, I know that talking is a lot better way than fighting to end conflict. I really do believe that women's empowerment is the most important revolution occurring in the world today. And we really support that. I believe it will change every society. And so especially in this field of anti-genocide activity, I think women's empowerment and women's voices must be central to our way of ending genocide.
Thank you both for answering our audience question. I really appreciate that speaking. As we always encourage, speaking your mind, and that's the only way that we can resolve these critical and difficult issues that we are talking about. I would like to take an opportunity for myself to answer some of the questions. I will just either echo or add to what you already said in regard to engaging the Biden administration. Something that is really important, and I wanted to know that most people in our liberal community, people sometimes when they have their government in office, they don't speak enough. And that was the problem during the Obama administration. But I hope that with every single individual, especially the human rights community, that we talk to them in person and personal and use our relationship with them. And if they don't listen, we should not shy away of shaming and naming them and speaking up to mobilize citizens to hold them accountable, because that hasn't been the case. And you shouldn't be speaking, as Dr. Greg said, genocide prevention is not a bipartisan issue. You shouldn't be speaking or blaming someone who you disagree with him. And as I always say that your son or your child or your daughter that you love, you tell them the truth even when it's hard, so that they can do something right and you be proud of them. That's exactly applicable to our political either allies or opponent. Like the truth must be told. And that's something that I'm very concerned about it. And many in our anti-genocide community are concerned about it, that when Biden comes, our community will mute themselves because someone who is their friend is in office. And I hope that doesn't happen. Another thing why genocide continue is that there are not enough people speaking about it. And also people mistakenly think that genocide happened in 100 days, like taking Rwanda as an example. In Darfur, it's been the longest genocide in history. It is ongoing and it is continued today. The people who are attacked in Darfur today are the tribes that are singled out from the beginning to be exterminated. They are the people who are still in camps. And it's very different right now. Darfur can be very free and welcoming to some people, but it will be very scary to other people. And that needs to be understood, and that sustained engagement. Another point that Dr. Greg has pointed out, and we have done with my team, we do search like as resources is one of the difficult issues to secure for genocide prevention. There is no foundation, and I would challenge you, if you can do your search and bring me one foundation of all those who are giving money out for genocide prevention. So no wonder why genocide does not stop. We are easy to blame government, to hold government accountable. We are not ready to hold donors accountable. We need to have also systemic education and advocacy to donors so that they understand that their contribution, their participation is important in this regard. To your point, Dr. Mukesh, of course, as I always make an example with an organization that I really like the most, Oxfam Great Britain, and Darfur Women Action Group. It is not the geographical limit. Darfur Women Action Group, the vision is really huge, but the limitation right now because of lack limited resources and manpower. We also, in the work that we do, we have to be realistic. You don't give hope to people in Eastern Sudan that you are going. We speak about Darfur because of the urgency, but just through our symposium, as of now, we have been able to bring women survivors to speak and give them a voice and build alliance with them from 9 countries, from Nigeria to Kurdistan, Iraq, and that will continue to happen. As I say to people, that Oxfam started out of Oxford from students who were responding to World War II famine, but it continued today working in over 200 or like 150 countries all around the world. And that's exactly the vision that the Darfur Women Action Group grounded in. But of all you know, our struggle, this is your organization, we're working together, and we are hoping to grow and include as many people as possible. There is a question about if there is any archive or documented or documentary or documentation of, unfortunately, there are various like sporadic and scattered documentaries and documentation, but there is no one that is systematic. And I hope that right now, with help from all of you and the international community, that we can be able to build established records for the Darfur genocide in a systematic way that we can be able to utilize it to hold perpetrators accountable, but also to restore dignity for the victims and make sure that this is not something that we forget and goes unnoticed. With this, I will stop here. I think we stole time from our next panelist, and I'm sorry for that. We will be ending here. Thank you so much, Dr. Kapila and Dr. Greg, but I also would love to have you around. We may have more questions at the end, and then also we'll zoom into our strategic recommendation. So I will stop here. We may do like if people want to take a quick break for 2 minutes, not more, and then we will come back and resume. And also for our audience, please stick around, don't go away. You have more incredible speakers coming, and so please stick around. Muna, the floor is yours, and thank you also for our other panelists, Ambassador Stephen Rapp and Ms. Clooney, for joining us in such a short notice. And I saw this is because of your commitment to these issues, and because of the fight that brought us together. That's why we always go to you, to these type of people. And this is like the 5th or 6th time for Ambassador Rapp and Muna to come to our symposium and our presentation, but also Dr. Greg, who's been always partnering with us, and Dr. Mukesh Kapila since I was in that board. So I cannot hope for any afternoon with people other than the people around me right now. Muna, the floor is yours.
Thank you, dear Niemat, dear friend and mentor. It brings us together at a very, very crazy time. We've all had an incredibly crazy Corona year, for lack of a better word, but it has been a rather ironic time as well. Since we last met, the world continues to get crazier and less predictable. And while accountability and justice for genocide have evaded us in so many places, the Yazidis in Iraq, the Rohingya in Myanmar, and more recently now the Uyghurs in China facing atrocities that have yet to be accounted for, there seem to be glimmers of hope for peace and justice for the people of Darfur and the people of Sudan. And yet the craziness is compounded by irony. Just as the International Criminal Court prosecutor Fatou Bensouda is being welcomed into Sudan, she is being banned and prohibited and sanctioned by the US. Just as the head of the Sovereign Council of Sudan is assuring the world, including Human Rights Watch, that no one is above the law, the US president is talking about pardoning himself. Just as Sudan is being taken off the terrorist sponsors list and being asked to normalize relations with Israel without any regard for the war crimes committed by that country, and being made to pay a rather large ransom to the victims of the terrorism of Al-Qaeda and Al-Shabaab supported by the previous regime, there's been no demand that that former regime acknowledge its own victims in its own country against its own nationals. So these are the ironies of this crazy time. And yet, despite all of that, we have to remain optimistic, as you rightly noted, and recognize that there is progress towards justice. And one of the few areas that have seen some advancement in this crazy year has been Sudan. We have Bashir is in jail in Khartoum, no thanks to the international mechanisms, but thanks to the people of Sudan. He is awaiting prosecution on a range of national and international crimes and is still wanted on an ICC warrant for genocide, crimes against humanity, including rape as a weapon of war, all committed in Darfur. Khoshaib, the top Janjaweed commander, has surrendered to the ICC in June 2020 and is now in custody in The Hague, facing 53 counts of war crimes and crimes against humanity. Haroun and Hussein are also in custody, awaiting justice, whether in Sudan or in the ICC remains to be seen. And one fifth ICC indictee, Mr. Abdullah Banda, remains at large. It is not yet clear whether Bashir will face justice at home or in the ICC. If he's tried at home, he'll face the death penalty. If he's tried by the ICC, he will not. But that is really only half the story. For once we establish accountability for the perpetrators of these atrocious crimes, and these are only a fraction of those who are responsible for those crimes, we must also address ourselves to the victims. And I agree with previous speakers that victims is the wrong word, because thanks to you, Niemat, firsthand, I have witnessed these victims become the strongest and most articulate advocates for peace and justice. I have seen them grow into messengers of peace and messengers of justice in the same way that I have seen them ask not only to prevent further genocides across the world and to reach out to victims from other genocides around them in Africa and Asia and elsewhere, but that they have identified that in order to prevent the next genocide, we must hold those accountable for the current ones accountable. And as we have many times said, Sudan has benefited from one of the most robust regimes, Security Council Chapter 7 sanctions and ICC referral, actual warrants, And yet Bashir is technically under custody, but he's not yet answered for his crimes. The victims have not seen their day in court. They have not been given compensation. If the American victims of Al-Qaeda and Al-Shabaab terrorism can preemptively be given an escrow account, then why can't the victims of the former Sudanese regime be given actual compensation for the crimes that have been documented, verified, and substantiated by the ICC? So we come at a time where there's glimmers of hope and yet no need for complacency. We are here to honor the dignity of those victims as we commemorate the International Day. And we are here to add our voices to the various efforts to prevent and punish genocide. Who better to help us do that than our two keynote speakers today, Mr. Stephen Rapp and Ms. Amal Clooney. They need no introduction, and as such, it makes it an even bigger honor to introduce them. Mr. Ambassador Stephen Rapp is the former U.S. Ambassador at Large for War Crimes in the U.S. State Department. He has a distinguished and an accomplished career as Chief Prosecutor of the Special Court for Sierra Leone, where he prosecuted the Liberian President, Charles Taylor, and Chief of Prosecutions at the UN International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda. He's currently serving as a Distinguished Fellow at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum Center for Prevention of Genocide, and as Chair of the Commission of International Justice and Accountability, which has prepared thousands of cases for prosecution of war crimes committed in Iraq and Syria. Ms. Amal Clooney is well known to us all. We are honored to have her with us today, the first in the Symposium series that we have begun many years ago. A recognized barrister who specializes in public international law, including international criminal law and international human rights law. She has represented clients, including the Nobel laureate, the Yazidi Nadia, before international courts, including the ICC and the European Court of Human Rights, as well as in the US and UK national courts. Ms. Clooney is currently a visiting professor at Columbia Law School and the president and co-founder of the Clooney Foundation for Justice, which advocates for justice through accountability for human rights around the world. Without further ado, Ambassador Rapp, the floor is yours.
Well, I'm very honored to be with you today, to be with my good friends Amal and Mona, but particularly to be back with Niemat, as Niemat indicated 5 or 6 times beforehand to the fall conference of the Darfur Women Action Group, working with you to try to achieve justice for the survivors of the genocide in Darfur, a genocide which you note continues. This year, of course, we're actually holding this on a famous anniversary date, the 9th of December, which is the 72nd, I should say, anniversary of the UN General Assembly passing the Genocide Convention and sending it out to the world for ratification. And it's now recognized as universal law across the world, even outside the countries that have ratified it. As Mona indicated, I now work with the U.S. Holocaust Museum. I've been supported by their Center for the Prevention of Genocide since I left the State Department 5 years ago. And that's an institution that has a center that's really dedicated to the idea of, for memory of the Holocaust, we achieve action. And toward that end of never again, as Mukesh said, an end that's been hard to achieve, but with my own particular work falling in this area of accountability. From my own experience, I guess it's not just a question of faith, it's what I've seen in so many places, that accountability and justice can help, it can contribute to the prevention of genocide by the reinforcement of this international norm, but particularly by the way in which it ends the impunity, both the realistic and the expectation of impunity that these powerful men have, that they can commit these crimes and get away with it. And as Mukesh said in the previous panel, when we look at a situation like Rwanda, there were mass killings in the 50s, and the 60s, and the 70s, and the 80s, and even in the early 90s, before the great genocide of almost 1 million Tutsis and those that would protect them in Rwanda in 1994. And that perception of impunity was allowed to build and build and build. So if you can kill 1,000, if you can kill 10,000 without consequences, you can proceed to finish the job and create a situation where, as they said in the propaganda, the only Tutsis left alive would be in the history books. And it's that perception that justice begins to knock back. But what I particularly notice is when that justice empowers the victims, it is particularly effective. I mean, quite often when you try these cases, as we do at the international level, like the Milosevic's or the Charles Taylors, of course, their argument is, oh, it's other powers that have come after us. It's our political enemies that have ganged up on us. But when the case is about the victims, when the victim's truth, when the survivor who testifies, when that truth breaks that impunity, then I think we really begin the work of preventing future genocides. I became a prosecutor sort of mid-career. I've been a defense attorney in my own country, and I was fortunate to be appointed a chief federal prosecutor in my home state. And it was at a time when Congress had passed the Victims of Crime Act, and in my first year, it passed the Violence Against Women Act. And becoming a representative of the state, of authority, and everything else wasn't something that I was particularly comfortable with. But the idea that the law and the capacity of the law could be employed on behalf of the victims, but on behalf of the communities that are that face these predations, that face selfish and brutal acts by powerful individuals who think they can get away with it. That one comes into the system of justice and steps on the scale on the side of those that have committed these crimes and reverses that powerful relationship. I saw it particularly in filing the first Violence Against Women Act case in the United States, where a woman who'd been shot multiple times by her spouse, but she'd always been intimidated from even reporting the crime. We were able to use the fact that his gun was the possession of it was a violation of federal crime to federalize the case and actually to protect her and to change the power relationship that had made her a victim time after time after time. I saw it at the international level when I went to the Rwanda Tribunal in 2001 and was parachuted in to be the senior prosecutor in charge of the media trial, which had then been going on for about 7 months. And I carried that case forward with a great team for another 27 months until we achieved the first convictions in the history of the world for the mass media, for agents or principals of the mass media, for the crime of direct and public incitement to genocide. And it was an enormously challenging task, but one in which we, of course, had to prove that the broadcasts that were full of that were in a foreign language that people didn't understand, and proverbs that required interpretation, that we required the proof that these men who we had on trial, who were very powerful individuals, one a professor who had a degree of distinction from the University of Paris, another who'd been an executive at the Organization for African Union and Addis, that these men were responsible for that radio and for those broadcasts that had made it possible for the genocide in Rwanda not to be committed here and there, wherever they were in a harm way, but frankly, it was possible to have the kind of air support that ensured that the genocide happened in every village, every commune, on every hill that was under the control of the interim government. And it was of enormous value to develop the partnerships with the witnesses, particularly the victims and survivors, who could talk about the impact of those broadcasts and what they had heard and then what they had seen. And that was the key to the success in that case. And I remember on the day in which the judgment came down, 17 years ago this week, and of course, when you're in trial, you're always looking at, well, you didn't win at this crime scene, this count wasn't successful, they didn't all get life, one got 35 years, et cetera. And I remember going out and speaking to one of the survivors who was in the gallery and discussed what he thought of the judgment that day. And he said, I just could have never imagined this day. I mean, these were men so powerful that I couldn't sit in the same room with them. Men who were above reproach, above challenge. You know, men who made possible those broadcasts that killed my wife, that killed my sister, that called us vermin and Tutsi women vipers that deserve to be raped and killed. And today they stand in front of all the world and are sentenced for the crime of genocide. I mean, this is the greatest day of my life now. I said to him, but we don't have reparations here. There are things that still need to be done. So, but this is really, really important. I saw that in perhaps a process that was better, and it wasn't a reflection of what we did at the Security Council or anything like that in the Habre case in Senegal, and I was proud to be involved in a role in getting the U.S. to support that effort, even though the United States at the time had supported Habre when he was a dictator in Chad. But we came in on the side of having that trial and internationalizing it to permit him to be charged in Senegal for the crime of rape as a crime against humanity, for torture, and for other horrendous atrocities. And that was a case in which the victims had played the essential role. They were represented in court in that civil law practice, but they had been the people who, from the time those crimes had been committed in the 80s, people like Jacqueline Medina and Suleiman Gang, et cetera, had fought to bring that case forward, and had identified and found and worked with human rights partners to bring out the evidence that showed that Habre was in charge of the torture and was getting reports and was writing on the reports, "No one leaves this prison alive." And they had that evidence, and they brought it forward in court. And of course, it included victims of sexual violence who specifically testified to having been raped by Habre, the president of the Republic himself. And there he was in court, a man who'd emptied the treasury of the country when he went into exile in Senegal a quarter of a century earlier. And he was finally facing justice. I remember talking to Suleiman Gang after that proceeding, and he described the moment of his testimony. Now, he'd left the area, and he was perhaps safer than other victims are. And he gained some confidence in what was possible through justice. But he said, when I sat there in court and looked across at this man who'd been dictator, I was never taller in all my life. And that's what justice can be, empowering the victims and empowering their truth and diminishing and breaking the power and the impunity that permits these crimes to continue. Now, of course, that alone, I talk about victims that I worked with in Sierra Leone, the amputees like Jabedi Mambo, who would just love to see the convictions. He said, when the prosecution wins, we win, holding up his arm without a hand. But of course, he said, we can't eat judgments. And so quite often these systems are lacking, and more needs to be done. But the key aspect of it that's essential in all of the processes, and beginning in these great international cases, is that the victims and the survivors be at the center of it. I'm proud to be followed by my friend Amal Clooney, who's worked so closely with victims and so many survivors in so many situations, and I think we may be involved in the Ali Kashab case as a representative of victims, and I hope people sign up and participate in that case. I guess it's now the Ali Muhammad al-Rahman case is his true name, but we also look for the day and hope that the United States will use the kind of leverage that we used to bring Ntaganda and Ungwen to the ICC and Mladic and Milosevic to the ICTY and Kambanda to the ICTR and Habre to the trial in the extraordinary African chambers, so that we have Bashir and Haroun and Hussein in trial soon in The Hague, in processes that are well done and in which the victims the survivors play a key part. That's only the beginning of justice, and I'm certainly ready to work with everyone here and particularly Darfur Women Action Group on this process of justice, in which I think we finally do see the way is open, and with the right kind of support and the continued pressure, I think justice can be achieved, and I'm with you on it all the way. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Rapp. Indeed, we've seen now multiple examples of sitting and former heads of state being charged and even being prosecuted. And hopefully, when enough of them have faced justice and faced their victims, it will begin to start serving as a deterrent. Thus far, however, we have not seen that. The genocides continue, and the words "never again" seem to remain hollow as we see one genocide after the other. But the examples that you cited are certainly building blocks to for a better future, and we count on your contribution in that regard. Ms. Clooney, it is an honor to give you the floor, and we look forward to hearing from you from the unique perspective of having sat side by side with the victims whose voices have brought these men to justice. So the floor is yours.
Sorry, I will start that again with sound. I was just saying thank you so much for having me. This is my first time speaking at the Darfur Women Action Group annual panel event, but it's given me a lovely opportunity to reconnect with some old friends, not old in age, of course, but in terms of going back a long way. So it's a pleasure to be here with you. And, you know, I've been thinking this week as we've been watching images of vaccines, wonderful images of vaccines being delivered to people in need, the beginning of the end of the pandemic, that it's an amazing example of human ingenuity and what we can do to solve global crises. But unfortunately, in my work, what I see is how we can also fall so terribly short. My work deals with what could be called an epidemic of violence, including genocide and crimes against humanity and sexual violence that we see happening all over the world. People who are killed or whose lives are ruined just because of the color of their skin or their religion or just where they were born. And I believe that the antidote is justice. But unfortunately, as others have said, accountability is all too rare. More than 70 years ago, after the Holocaust, the world did say never again, and governments later created institutions supposedly to make that a reality: the UN Security Council, the International Criminal Court. But in recent times, the UN Security Council has been inactive or divided on practically every major crisis that the world has faced. And the International Criminal Court has been under threat from the very government, the United States, that first fought for international justice at Nuremberg. But in this bleak landscape, I do see some glimmers of hope. And my work over 20 years has focused on using international law to advance justice. And in the last few years, my husband, George, and I have set up a foundation whose mission is justice through accountability. All of our projects are about ways to bring support to survivors of human rights abuses and hold criminals to account. So today, I'd like to talk about 3 cases that I'm involved in where there is an opportunity for justice. The first is the Yazidi Genocide. As many of you know, in 2014, ISIS began a genocide of Yazidi people in Iraq and Syria, killing thousands and displacing almost 500,000 people. They also instituted a system of slavery and mass rape of women and girls, literally buying, selling, and trading women in physical markets and online, and trying to exterminate this group because they did not pray the right way. 4 years ago, I met one of the Yazidis who'd fled Iraq and found refuge in Europe, Nadia Murad. We collected testimonies, we visited women's shelters and refugee camps, we lobbied the UN to set up an international team to gather evidence so that justice could one day be possible. And eventually we sat in the Security Council and we watched 15 hands go up to create this investigative team. And earlier this year, they exhumed the mass grave where Nadia's mother is buried. We've also been able to work with prosecutors to trigger cases in national courts. I now represent a Yazidi victim in Germany in the first trial charging an ISIS fighter with genocide anywhere in the world. Of course, more needs to be done, but at least ISIS is finally in the dock and the process of accountability has begun. Second, in Myanmar. In the last few years, Myanmar's military and security forces have instituted a genocide through so-called clearance operations against the Rohingya community in what the UN described as textbook ethnic cleansing. Mass murder, rape, and families burnt to death inside their homes have led hundreds of thousands to flee, creating the largest refugee camp in the world next door in Bangladesh. Finally, some steps are being taken to address these crimes. And over the next 2 years, I will be working on a case seeking to establish Myanmar's legal responsibility for genocide at the International Court of Justice in The Hague. Finally, Sudan. It has been almost 20 years since a terrible conflict erupted in Darfur. And I'm proud to say that my husband, George, was one of the people who traveled there to witness the abuses firsthand and challenge world powers with what he saw. Hundreds of thousands of people were killed in one of the worst atrocities of our generation. But now, finally, thanks to the bravery of the Sudanese people, there is hope. Thanks to so many courageous Sudanese, including many young people and women who risked their lives for their country. The oppressive 30-year rule of Omar al-Bashir has been brought to an end. It has been called the improbable revolution. Young men and women who were human rights activists are now government ministers. The former president sits in prison alongside two of his former ministers, Ahmad Haroun and Abdulrahim Hussein, and a senior leader of the Janjaweed military force responsible for some of the most gruesome attacks is in custody in The Hague. This is an extraordinary opportunity for justice. And this opportunity for justice in Sudan exists because the people demanded it. Because people in Sudan, this opportunity for justice exists because the people demanded it. But many people in Sudan are not part of the conversation now about where to put Omar al-Bashir on trial. And many Sudanese people inside Sudan, next door in Chad, or who are exiled abroad, don't know that they have the right to participate in the trial against Ali Kushayb and to claim compensation if he is convicted. This is what I am now working to change. Earlier this year, I started working with the Darfur Women's Action Group and other Sudanese NGOs that approached me to be their lawyer to give advice on how they could pursue justice. I now represent a number of survivors of war crimes and crimes against humanity committed in Darfur, and I would encourage others who've been victims of crimes committed by Ali Kushayb or others to come forward by contacting the Darfur Women's Action Group or others they trust so that their voices can be heard. In all my work with survivors, it has been clear that without justice, wounds fester and grief is compounded. Impunity leads to new cycles of violence, and denial allows history to repeat itself. So I want to say to the Sudanese people, this is your moment, a moment not for revenge, but reckoning, a moment not to look back, but to make it possible to move forward, so that justice and dignity can be restored and Sudan can truly say, never again. The Darfur Women's Action Group has written a letter to the Sudanese Prime Minister in which they say there has never been a better time to pursue justice for the victims. I believe this is true for all the victims of crimes and especially for the women, girls, and victims of sexual violence who have been ignored for far too long. Thank you for this opportunity to participate today, and I look forward to our conversation.
Thank you, Amal, and thank you, Ambassador Rapp. Incredibly punctual and very proud of us as a panel as we move into the Q&A portion of the session. We have, as with the previous panel, received several questions and several suggestions, in fact. Some were made by the previous speaker, Mr. Stanton, and then we've received some from Professor Weiss, proposing that we think a little bit outside of the box from the traditional mechanisms of justice, including the idea that we heard earlier about establishing an office for the prevention of genocide in Sudan. In previous years, we've heard suggestions regarding the need to implement existing policies in the US for human rights due diligence, such as the Leahy Amendment. We've talked about submitting information to the prosecutor as well as to the Universal Periodic Review in the Human Rights Council. So all of these mechanisms do exist. But what seems to be gaining currency to solve the divide between those who see Bashir and the others being tried at home versus those who advocate for the handover to the ICC for a full international prosecution are those who talk about a hybrid prosecution or a hybrid court established for that purpose. And when they talk about that, they refer to the ICTY and the ICTR as precedents, failing to note that these two ad hoc criminal tribunals were established before the existence of the ICC. And now that we have the ICC, there would be no need to establish any additional ad hoc ones. The other example is the Special Tribunal for Lebanon, which they often cite as another example. But again, it's a bit of a misplaced precedent to the extent that the STL tried a local political assassination or terrorist attack against the former prime minister and his entourage. It was not about international crimes of universal jurisdiction, such as genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. So in light of those comments, what do you, Ambassador Rapp, and see as the pros and cons of the traditional mechanisms of justice, such as the ICC and or this idea of a hybrid court as an innovative or out-of-the-box kind of suggestion? And of course, feel free to recommend any third options for transitional justice. Clooney, maybe we hear from you first this time.
Sorry, did you say me?
Yes, please.
Okay. Well, look, I think first of all, an advantage that you're looking for is a court that already exists rather than one that you want to try and build from scratch. You know, I worked on the investigation that preceded the Special Tribunal for Lebanon, and I worked in the prosecutor's office at that court, and we know that you know, these processes take a frustratingly long time, and I think victims you know, suffer from that. I think that, you know, we have to support the ICC and try and bridge the impunity gap that exists because of those states that haven't signed up for the court. And that doesn't mean that that's the full solution, but it can be a very important part of the solution. You know, at the end of the day, even where the ICC is engaged, you might have 4 or 5 senior people being tried. That's not enough to deal with the magnitude of the crimes that we are speaking about. But I think, you know, where the ICC is a possibility, the idea of starting from scratch and setting up a whole new mechanism to put the same people on trial that the ICC could try doesn't really make a lot of sense. And I think the other thing to keep in mind when you're weighing options is, where will the victims feel safe? Where is it possible for witnesses to be protected when they're going to give evidence in extremely sensitive issues and in circumstances, you know, where there, you know, there is still an unstable political and security climate. So these, you know, there is no sort of one size fits all solution, but I certainly would discourage those who are thinking through options for justice in Sudan from, you know, starting on a process that is going to delay justice for far longer than the victims should have to wait.
If I can jump in then, you know, I am frankly a fan of hybrid justice, and frankly thought my experience at the Special Court for Sierra Leone, a hybrid court that was established in an agreement between the United Nations and the government of Sierra Leone, was actually preferable to the International Tribunal of Rwanda, even though I had a very good experience there. I liked very much being in the country, having 60% of the employees being nationals, having judges from the system, investigators from the system. Of course, that was a situation where the ICC didn't have jurisdiction because the crimes occurred before it came into being, and where it was necessary to set up a court, and work was done relatively quickly to get it going. But everything had to be built fundamentally from scratch. And I think in the situation that we have in Darfur, because of the Security Council referral and because of the ICC having done investigation, not that they don't need to continue to reinforce the case and identify witnesses, and victims need and survivors need to be actively involved in that. I'd hate to see the case fail, and the ICC has, you know, failed in Kenya and failed in Bemba and I hope not. We'll see it on an appeal in its courts in Cote d'Ivoire. So it's absolutely critical that that these cases go to the ICC, that they be 3 or 4 times more effective than they've been in the past, not go in like they did in Kenya with only 7 cases and 7 people in witness protection. I mean, just unthinkable, the kind of weakness this court has presented in the past. But I support it, and I want to see the United States become, again, at least a non-party partner to the court to make sure that it has the capacity to do it. But since it's there, and since the indictments are there, and since there's a solid legal basis through the Security Council, I see no reason to create a new court to try the 4 individuals that have been charged. Plus, of course, we've got the Banda case and the Haskanita attack that was associated with the JEM. So I think that that's the place to go. I would note that in other situations, even in, say, the ICTY, they worked to develop a mixed court in Bosnia, which went on and tried other cases with initially international judges and personnel. In the Central African Republic, we now have a court, a special court, even in a country that is now proceeding on its second referral with the ICC, with accused now under arrest and in custody, and others we believe that will be charged in the future, but a court that can handle more mid-level sort of offenders and deliver justice closer to the people. I would note that a hybrid court can sometimes deal with the security issue. We relocated people in the Sierra Leone court to some to Europe. We were able to change the venue of the trial of Taylor from Freetown, where we tried all our other cases, to The Hague under special arrangements. So sometimes you can make this particular vehicle work, but having started down the road and the court being ready and now proceeding soon with confirmation on Ali Kashab, I don't think it makes sense to now try to create a court that couldn't actually proceed on those cases for another 2 or 3 years.
Can I just respond to that as well? I agree that there definitely can be instances where a hybrid court is very valuable. For instance, we talked earlier about the Yazidi genocide. I've argued that a hybrid court, involving Iraq and the UN could be very valuable in that context, where you've got serious due process concerns about how national trials are being carried out in Iraq, and you don't have the possibility of the ICC for the time being. So there could be a hybrid court that could also deal with many more defendants than typically the ICC is able to deal with. But I think one of the innovations and particularly encouraging parts of the process at the ICC is actually victim participation. So at the Yugoslavia and Rwanda tribunals, you didn't have the possibility of victims actually being represented by their own lawyer, having their own voice throughout the proceedings, and then also being able to ask for reparations at the end under some circumstances. And I think that's something that can also be part of hybrid processes. It was part of the process in Cambodia. So if it is hybrid, let's make it the best of all worlds, and in something like the Yazidi genocide, I think that's a possibility. But for Sudan, there is an arrest warrant and there is an obligation to comply with that, and I hope that that's what will happen, and I hope that the trials will take place under circumstances where victims will feel safe and able to give evidence in an environment where they don't have to suffer further risks or actions taken against them.
Excellent points, both. There's, in a way, 3 pillars to what justice means. The first is the accountability of the perpetrator. The second, as we've heard from Ms. Clooney, is the justice for the victim. But the third is the deterrent value in terms of the messaging towards other potential and or current genocidaires around the world and other war criminals. And there's far too many to name in the little time that we have left. Which of the transitional justice mechanisms, whether it's the criminal court, whether it's local prosecution, whether it's something as horrific as Gaddafi's ultimate fate, or whether it's more of an apartheid era kind of truth and reconciliation mechanism, which of these 4 options, and there are many more, of course, do you think sends the loudest and clearest message for purposes of deterrence? Ambassador Rapp, if I can ask you to answer with your views on that question.
And naturally, I think justice needs to include all of these elements, and it's not possible to try even every senior perpetrator. I'm strongly in favor of holding the people who made it happen to account. And we heard earlier discussion about this genocide being sort of hardwired in the species, and indeed there's all sorts of historical resentments and histories, but it's been selfish individuals that have then run the current through those wires and moved people to become killers against people that were formerly their neighbors, and doing it not for the interests of even those low-level perpetrators, but for the interests of the powers that be, for preserving their wealth, for preserving their power by essentially blaming the other for the crime. So holding those people to account, I think, is essential. Just as trying the mafia or trying other kind of organized criminal activity is key to it. But it's not enough. And I certainly hope we can do more, particularly for making the perpetrators pay reparations, though many times their assets are beyond reach. But certainly in the context here, and I know there have been efforts to go after the French banks in regard to sanctions breaking that affect, sanctions came in because of the genocide in Darfur. We've got a case out of South Sudan, later became South Sudan, against Lundin Petroleum and in Sweden that could get victims compensation. I do think that more needs to be done in that area. But fundamentally, at the end of the day, it's about establishing the truth from the survivors, and that can also be done through truth and reconciliation processes, understanding that even a full confession sometimes of these crimes isn't sufficient to escape accountability for them.
Thank you, Ambassador Rapp. Ms. Clooney?
Thank you. I mean, I agree with what Stephen has just said. I think the best message to those who perpetrate these kinds of crimes would be a consistent one, so that rather than seeing what we do see, which is sometimes these crimes are met with condemnation, sometimes there's an investigation, sometimes very rarely there's a prosecution, then we need to change the default from impunity to accountability, or at least get much closer and move the needle closer in that direction. But I mean, I agree, it's a whole package of measures. Those of us who work in international justice know that 5 trials in The Hague aren't going to solve, problems that affect, very large communities on the ground. And you have to look at it holistically, whether it's about protecting the victims and, educational measures and sort of, ways to memorials and museums and how the impact on sort of education of future generations. It's holistic when it comes to, you have to be holistic when it comes to protection, but also when it comes to punitive measures. So I completely agree. It's not just 5 senior people who you need to think about. It's all the enablers. And I'm actually working on the Lafarge case that Stephen mentioned. You have to start going after those who financed these kinds of crimes. Individual states, an increasing number actually now have global human rights sanctions regimes. This week, the EU adopted its own regime, which I think could be a game changer in terms of accountability for human rights abuses just yesterday. So that, there's a whole package of measures, but you need politicians to put this higher up the list of priorities. And I think that with the new administration in the US, we may see, hopefully we'll see some real changes in terms of the attitude to sort of multilateral efforts towards accountability. And I hope that will, lead to a series of measures that will actually benefit people on the ground. Because I think in this area of work, you see so many great speeches and resolutions and commitments, and not necessarily that much concrete activity, and it needs leadership. So I hope that will come from Washington as well as other places as we go into 2021.
Indeed. In the last 30 seconds, I see Mr. Stanton has raised his hand. I will leave it to Niemat to field the last round of questions. My time is up. I want to thank you both for your incredible experience and the insight that you bring as a result of that experience, both on the side of the prosecution as well as the support to victims and witnesses. I believe are all of one mind to ensure that justice is done for the victims and accountability for the perpetrators. We have a consensus in favor of ICC prosecution. But as long as justice occurs, we continue to fight for it across the globe. And Niemat, you lead us in that fight, and I give you back the floor.
Well, thank you so much, Mona, and our 2 speakers, Ms. Clooney and Ambassador Stephen Rapp. That was a great panel, and all the points you raised are really important for us to think of, an opportunity that we can explore, but also challenges that we need to address and be proactive in terms of thinking of what we can do. I know our panel is scheduled to end, but I definitely like speaking about genocide and accountability and war crimes is not an easy task, and there's always expectation. And so I will maintain a flexibility for people if they wanted to answer more questions. Also, our audience sent some of the questions that I think Mona has already posed, some of them. But I think Dr. Greg was, hands was up, so I would give Dr. Greg an opportunity. He may have a question for our two speakers, and then we will figure out how we move forward. We still have more.
Yeah, this is a question for Amal Clooney. One of the things that has occurred to me is that probably the next step in enforcing the Genocide Convention is to get a lot more countries to make the Genocide Convention a crime of universal jurisdiction. And you are representing people in such a case in Germany. As you well know, the US, Canada, Australia, a lot of Western Europe and so forth already have made genocide a crime of universal jurisdiction, along with torture. And by the way, I think there should be some officials in the current administration in the United States who should be charged with that. But I would like to see, I'd like your opinion about this and whether that should be part of our genocide prevention campaign from here on.
Thank you. I mean, I definitely think it's a very helpful option for victims. In the Yazidi case, it has been basically the only option because there is no international jurisdiction. And I sat in the Security Council and said, you know, this is a case that requires an international court. And I didn't think there would be anyone standing up for ISIS. I thought that would be one of my easier, you know, advocacy challenges. And in fact, it's been really difficult to establish any kind of international mechanism. So the availability of national trials has been really important for those victims. At the same time, it feels, you know, like such a, you know, small number of cases can be triggered compared to the crimes that have been committed. And Nadia, you know, one of my clients who has gone on to win the Nobel Peace Prize for her advocacy on this, you know, she said to me, if at the end of the genocide, you know, the ISIS fighters can just shave off their beards and go back to their normal life, that's the worst thing that could happen. But why is it that we as victims have to be the ones knocking on the doors of courts for justice? And it does feel like that. It feels like there isn't really an international structure where this just happens. You know, victims are the ones that are having to actually move this and trigger cases, you know, and sometimes national courts are the only option. So I certainly applaud prosecutors like those in Germany who are really sort of pushing ahead with these types of prosecutions. But without international cooperation on investigations and evidence sharing, those cases will remain few and far between, even where there is a legislative basis to proceed.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, Dr. Kabila's hand is up.
Hello?
Yes, you have the opportunity.
Oh, sorry.
To
Okay. Yeah. Two quick questions, comments, or whatever. You know, listening to the issues around mechanisms for justice, great. But I'm just worried. I mean, I've spent the last 20 years of my career in the business of witnessing genocides, not out of great career planning on my part. It is just accidentally ending up in those particular places. And it seems to me, can't our great judicial minds at least find a transitional justice mechanism or something where, while definitive mechanisms are found or so on, there is a way of giving transitional relief or something? Because I worry also that time is passing. And with that, I mean, you know, Amal will know this well from her considerations of Darfur victims now, is that the evidence gets degraded and the burden of proof required to prove someone guilty of something is so high in relation to the individual act of murder or violence, that it seems to be, it's a mountain to climb there. So that's one thing. There isn't any other creative judicial idea. My second thing is, and this is for everyone really, is that the word genocide, on one level, the word genocide is kind of what it is horrible. On the other hand, I've certainly found in my bureaucratic career as a British government civil servant and then as a UN civil servant, is that it's a very disempowering word, simply because to evoke the convention and to evoke the crime, to evoke the whatever it is that is, the compulsion to act, because if someone declares genocide, you're supposed to act, you see, under all circumstances. And many of the circumstances we find ourselves now in are not what we would call full-blown, if there is such a thing, genocide. I'm not speaking legally here. But the fact is, I feel that and I speak from the UN perspective, is that when you find yourself in a situation like that, and you witnessed tremendous crimes against humanity, but which may not meet the test of genocide, then what happens is, loose use of the term, or somehow conflating everything else, disempowers you from acting to prevent things. So I think mass atrocity crimes and so on and so on, language is changing in this particular area, but I have not necessarily found the Genocide Convention per se, and all the things built around it, particularly helpful in terms of confronting this issue in real time when one found oneself in a decision-making position, either on behalf of a government or on behalf of a multilateral system.
If I could just respond quickly to that,
sure.
I think there are positive developments that are essentially only beginning. But I think what we see now with the Syria mechanism, with the UNITAD in Iraq that Amal played such a key role in creating, with the mechanism now for Myanmar, that there really is this effort to work with civil society to develop the evidence, to demand that the UN itself preserve the evidence and share it. Obviously, horrified by the story that you told us earlier about your all your emails and all your communications being wiped out from Darfur in the past. But there is more being done, thanks to civil society and thanks to mandates that have often come from Geneva to preserve this evidence and make it available and prevent it from degrading, to be able to prove these cases when the opportunity for justice appears in a third country, eventually in an international court, or ideally back home after transition. On the Genocide Convention point, I share your frustration, and I often deal with groups that have had horrible things happen to them and say, we have a genocide, and it crushes me, and I don't, because I'm not courageous enough. I don't stand up and say, well, technically under the Genocide Convention, they were doing it to you on a political basis. And because they thought you were government opponents, that's not a genocide. That was considered in New York in 1947 and rejected. So it's not a genocide. It's sort of like Cambodia, 2 million people killed, maybe a genocide, a small genocide against the Khmer or the Vietnamese, but the major crime is a politicide. And what is that? Maybe a crime against humanity, persecution, and violence. And it underlines the importance of having an international convention, frankly, on crimes against humanity, and having a way into courts like the ICJ for those kind of offenses, and for the remedies to be more clearly defined than they were 72 years ago today in terms of the Genocide Convention. Of course, as you know, in the Myanmar case that Amal has talked about, the government's under provisional measures, and they reported to the court, but what they're doing is confidential, given the rules. And so what's actually happening as a result of that is sort of limited by that process. Frankly, it's from what we see on the ground, it's not meaningful. It's not full compliance. But so figuring out how to more effectively, enforce this duty to prevent and punish, I think needs to be added to the Genocide Convention or to practice, and we need to look at crimes against humanity and serious war crimes as well.
I would very much echo those sentiments. I think, on the investigation side, what would be extremely helpful is a standing, permanent investigative body within the United Nations or some kind of international coalition that says this body has talented investigators on it and forensics people on it, and it can be deployed under, X or Y criteria. You could have a role for the Secretary General or the UN Security Council, and there should be some kind of automatic process so that when it's determined that there's a credible basis for saying there's genocide occurring or mass human rights abuses or crimes against humanity, war crimes, there will be an international team, so that again you don't have this piecemeal approach where it's too little and often too late. So yes, we have these mechanisms now for Syria and Myanmar, but that's not enough, and they came later and they don't have proper access. So I think you do see, even on the investigation side, as I was saying, victims are the ones driving some of the prosecutions, but also NGOs are trying to fill the gap on the investigation side. And you're absolutely right, you need people to be able to respond immediately, because evidence does get degraded, and some witnesses become less willing to talk about these things later on. So I think some kind of permanent investigative international body would go a long way, so that you can at least preserve evidence while it's fresh. And even if discussions on the form of accountability take a long time, at least you haven't lost that opportunity. On your other question, of course, I think all of us would agree that while genocide is obviously a basis for international action, we would expect the same when it's crimes against humanity or war crimes or other serious human rights abuses. So it's not just trying to see the crimes more broadly, but also who are the perpetrators. And I think looking at all of those who are complicit, whether it's businesses or lower level people, is important in trying to address some of these conflicts.
I have to say, I would have been so happy if at the time that I was struggling with these issues in Darfur, there was some kind of competent investigation authority that would independently look at that. It would have relieved the pressure on me. I would have got on with my job, if you wish, as opposed to being torn in all directions. Is what's happening this, i.e. ethnic cleansing, genocide, or is it just seasonal fighting and God knows what other apologies people used to give, with the government pressurizing me on this side, and with the UN saying, keep your head down, don't say anything, don't create a political stink here. So I think this kind of independent investigative idea as a standing body is something that may take time to set up, but it's a very good idea. And it doesn't have to be standing. It could draw on the capacities of experts that are present all over the world. It's a bit like peacekeeping. Peacekeeping forces, there's no standing army in the world, but when the UN wants to mount a peacekeeping operation, it can draw on capacities from all over the world to do this. So that, I think, is something worth holding and seeing where it will take us in coming years.
Great, thank you, everyone. I wanted to say a few words about many things you have to talk about, but it's in relation to the reality today on the ground in Sudan. And then after that, I would appreciate the 3 top recommendations from each one of you on how to move forward in Darfur, but also in other situations, like in terms of preventing genocide, resolving the existing and ongoing, and also preventing the future ones. In looking at the situation in Darfur, of course, we have to appreciate the small victories that or progress that have been made. And looking a year ago, the situation would not have been, since that are happening right now, would not have been possible, like having Ali Kosheb in custody and having the ICC prosecutor visiting Sudan, and also having Sudan start being welcomed to the international forums and talking. Unfortunately, we see all of this and we appreciate the progress, and we have to communicate this to the victims and the survivors and our community. But it's just so hard to communicate this kind of progress when the victims have not moved one step forward from where they are. Like, people are still in camps. People are still so afraid to speak their truth. The phone lines are still spied on in Sudan. the communication in Darfur and internet access is horrible. It's set up the same way that Bashir has set it up. So I want us to be, like as Ambassador Rapp mentioned, is victim-centered or survivor-centered approach. It is very important that we all can push forward for more openness, for more access, for more protection, and creating enabling environment. For years in Sudan, there has been the humanitarian organization on the ground, but people are dying of hunger, people are dying of disease because of there is no enabling environment. The humanitarian are under threat, but they don't want to lose their funding. Anyways, they go to Sudan. They stay in Khartoum, they stay in Niyala, Al-Fashir, but they can't go to Kapila, my hometown. Sometimes 3 months people cut off. They can't even have soap. So that is still the situation. Also, a reminder, it's very important for people to understand that the genocide war crimes that has been committed, it's not just the Janjaweed alone. It is jointly with the government of Sudan. And now we have an entire army, the national army is mixed with the rapid support forces. And that is why right now people don't dare, like even when attack happens, they say, oh, these people have been attacked by an unidentified. And my fear is that it's going to be a narrative for people to escape the truth of talking about who is responsible. But also I was talking to someone in the camps and I said, how are people feeling about the persecutor going to Sudan? And the good answer is, well, it is important for us, but would a rape victim from Darfur will be able to go to Khartoum to visit with the Prime Minister or the Minister of Justice and publicly talk to them? Because the persecutor could come to Sudan because Sudan is seeking to be welcome again to the international community and international forums. They need support from the international community because they are struggling with the economic crisis. But also, the ICC is a state party institution, and they are looking into that. And now, this politician in Sudan, they have become so specialized in creating some sort of double standard. So the day that we can look for is the day that a victim or survivor in Sudan will walk into Khartoum without the fear of being retaliated against, and that is, there is still a very, very, very long way to go. It's also difficult. I'm not sure if you will have an answer for this. There has been multiple attacks, like say, right now the ICC has limited, like for instance, Aliko Sheikh case between 2003 and 2004. Since then, how many times these people have been displaced and killed? Like people have been systematically not killed in the villages because there's not many villages remain for Aliko Sheikh or the military and rapid support force to attack. But there has been attacks on internally displaced camps. There have been abduction and summary disappearance and summary exclusion and disappearance and things like that. There has been killing of students, human rights defenders, activists, women activists, incidents of rape, and all of that. So it's like repeatedly like using this tactic of not suppressing witness but eliminating witnesses. So that is, these are things that for us to pursue justice, we have to think of it and how we can overcome, and whether this international system is being set flexible to accommodate all of this development, or it is like mindful and capable of including this. So it is like with all of this and the hope that people have placed in the ICC, my fear is that when it comes sometimes, like we may end up with like half of the witnesses and the survivors, people with first-hand information may already be eliminated or may have developed trauma, and they need, so enabling environment is very, very important to this for us to pursue justice and be able and to have access to, for victims to have access to justice. And when it comes to women, it's even like nearly impossible. And something that also I have noticed, that people have been talking to so many people since the beginning of the crisis for almost like 2 decades. Now survivors like become reluctant to talk because they're just fed up of talking. They want to be detached of that. So then something needs to happen, that they either like feel safe or feel hopeful, or something needs to happen. And that is what we are trying to struggle to do, to make sure that the case of Ali Khoshaib can be stronger. If it can be stronger, then that will give more victims, more survivors a hope and motivate them to come forward and try to speak and see that there will be hope for justice. When it comes to the question of hybrid or trying them in The Hague or in Sudan, I think that question is very important, and also there's an important point for me here to make. As of now, ICC is the best option. We do know, and survivors know, because there have been a lot of talk about accountability and the ICC for years among the survivors and the affected communities. They know that ICC will not try every single individual, but it is very important. It's not just enough people, but it gives people a sense of justice. And it also, looking at the situation on the ground, something that I just spoke about, there's no any capability of protecting victims. There's no political will. Until today, like the leaders in Khartoum are not reluctant to speak, even in their, including Prime Minister Hamdok in his annual speech about the 1-year anniversary of them in government. He never mentioned Darfur, never mentioned South Kordofan, never mentioned Blue Nile. And that's concerning to us. They're escaping, so they try to be nice to the perpetrator versus the victims. Many people in Sudan believe that Bashir is being put in custody to prevent the ICC from arresting Bashir. It's not because that they are willing. Why they are keeping them? They don't even have resources to try Bashir in Sudan. So that was like, when it comes to options, I think victims need to be consulted. They need to be brought on board and be in the table of making those decisions. There are also many people in the Sudan, from the center, the elites, and the northern, who they feel like surrendering Bashir is a defeat for them, identity. It's kind of like superiority that they continue until the privilege that they have, and they have been taking advantage of by oppressing other people. They see it is kind of insult for them to send Bashir to Hague, and that's what they are playing right now. So it is very important to exercise pressure for all of you, wherever you talk to people in different forums. Make sure that they pressure the government right now in Khartoum to surrender those who are wanted by the ICC. And let us talk later on about what ICC is capable or not, because also right now, no victim, no witness will come forward, because the Sudanese army is the army of militia of Janjaweed, who have killed and commit genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. These are the people who rape the women. And so no one will dare to come forward. And then there is also this process of the Himeti is going out, giving people money and recruiting people from different tribes. So this is like, it's an attempt of silencing and keeping people quiet, or either bribing. And the situation, the economic crisis in Sudan, making people vulnerable to compromising. So these are all like challenges that for us to think of and talk, but it's important that victims have a voice on that. And the last word I will leave you with is that empowering victims to have a voice, to have capability, to work hand in hand in whatever that people want to do, to pursue justice, to sustain peace, to transform the country without bringing this, like committing genocide. It's not that something happened overnight, as Professor Greg and Mukesh and everyone, and you all know that there are people who are excluded and marginalized, and they have never been part of the decision making. Unless we empower those people and allow them to come into the center and be part of that decision making, be partner in that change making, we will never end one single genocide. And that's what has been happening around the world, and it is very present right now in that form. I'll stop here, and I hope to hear your recommendation, and then we'll go ahead and conclude our panel for this afternoon.
Okay, I'll go first, or unless Ambassador Rapp wants to do his conclusion. You know, Niemat, I fully support all of your efforts, and I think it's because of you and other courageous survivors and people from Darfur that, you know, some of these opportunities for justice exist today. I very much hope that we will see a continuation of some positive signs that we've seen in terms of legislative reforms on human rights, where, you know, now female genital mutilation has been criminalized, and there's no capital offense of apostasy anymore. And there's been a declaration about separating religion and state in the law. And I think there have been some positive developments at a time when we don't have much good news to report. So I hope that those within the authorities who are forces for good will get support, and I hope that there will be a maintained commitment to accountability. You know, we saw in the Juba Peace Accords that there is a commitment to cooperate with the ICC. Government officials have made a similar commitment, and I hope, you know, we will see that lead to future trials. I hope that the trial of Ali Khashayb will be successful. We know there's a very important hearing currently scheduled in The Hague in February, and I hope that it's a trial in which victims' voices will be heard loud and clear, and in which they feel that they're getting some measure of justice, and let that be just the first of a series of trials, and hopefully the beginning of a new era where we see increased accountability and increased prioritization of justice for the benefit of all survivors.
Thank you.
If I could then jump in, and I agree with everything that Amal said, and certainly Niemat as well. I share all of your views on this. Clearly, the justice issue is what we're talking about today, and that makes complying with the obligation to surrender these individuals to the ICC essential as part of the rule of law, and as part of being back within the international community, and having the benefits of trade or aid sorts of relations. It of course goes beyond that in terms of the diplomacy of a country like mine and the coming Biden administration. And even though, you know, the idea of international pressure and pushing a particular country to do something may cause some pushback, it's fundamentally about empowering the people of Sudan and toward a democratic transition, and really pressing forward for a genuine democratic transition, as opposed to a Potemkin village of a transition, which is what we have now. And then going with that are key elements of civilian protection and reconstruction, the kind of thing that's needed to bring people back that were driven away by the Janjaweed and the actions of the Sudan army. And of course, quite concerned about what's happening with UNAMID's withdrawal and what's going to happen to people in the immediate term. But you know, when they go, what is there? And that question has to be answered. And then there's this key issue of security sector reform. We talk about that in all sorts of transitions. It doesn't work very often, but I mean, fundamentally, it's about eliminating people from the ranks that are serious human rights violators, and establishing military services and security services on a professional basis. That has been done with some success in Sierra Leone and Liberia and elsewhere, but it's taken long efforts, and that needs to clearly be a part of the priority, together then with building the rule of law, where soldiers are held to account for acts of even not the most serious war crimes, but were acts of indiscipline or victimizing communities, et cetera, are met with discipline or prosecution, as are acts of corruption and other violence against by the strong against the weak. I mean, but that should come from a proper democratic transition, but with a lot of assistance. And I think it's really important that the international community, of course, at the time when COVID and everything else is diminishing budgets, really does get in and contribute in a very positive way to this transition. Otherwise, and we've had it before in Sudan, where before Bashir came to power, where there's been governments that were better and then they were thrown out, and we can't see that again. And that's why the international community needs to condition its support, but really develop a partnership with the people of Sudan for a better future.
Morning.
So, shall I make a comment, perhaps?
Yes, please.
Yeah. I want to agree with all the recommendations that Amal Clooney and Stephen Rapp have just made. I just believe in institutionalization of reform if possible. That's why we set up the ICTR, we set up the Sierra Leone Tribunal, we set up the ICC. When you have an institution created, it creates an inertia of its own to actually continue to carry forward the rule of law. And so I would recommend these three things. And I've already said a couple of them. The office, I believe we need a Sudanese Office of Genocide Prevention. And that needs to be created in Sudan by Sudanese people. And it needs to be empowered and given resources. We also then, secondly, need a Sudanese Office of Special Investigations and Prosecution of crimes against humanity, genocide, and war crimes. And it, again, needs to be resourced. And you have to hire people with courage to lead it and who are incorruptible. Good luck on that, I know. And then finally, I would recommend a reform in the International Criminal Court itself. I would like to see an amendment to the ICC statute that would establish an ICC police force to arrest ICC charged perpetrators. Not everybody, not a generalized police force for the world, but only people who have been charged by the ICC. Now, this could be, in fact, adopted by the Assembly of States Parties. It doesn't even have to go to the UN. And it could be then adopted by states parties. It won't cover the whole world, but nevertheless, in fact, you could also resource it through the UN and through the assessments of states parties to the ICC treaty.
Thank you, Dr. Greg. Mona?
Thank you, Niemat. I just wanted to draw some threads together for your recommendations, as we do usually at the end of these symposia. I think there's the idea has been repeated by the Office of the Prevention of Genocide. I would like to slightly amend the proposal and maybe say it's the Office of the Prevention and Punishment of Genocide in Sudan, in order to create a component for victim support and victim protection and victim compensation. In addition to the accountability elements that we've already addressed. At the UN level, I think we need to strengthen the Office of the Prevention of Genocide to elevate the special advisor to a more robust role, one that has the authority to coordinate the various UN mechanisms that currently exist, as well as to advance the investigations of the Human Rights Council. The commissions of inquiry have been very successful, but their recommendations seem to sort of stay at the table. We need to advance them towards the enforcement measures of the council. And last but not least, I think we need to strengthen the accountability for the Security Council itself. The permanent members have enjoyed the paralysis of the council for far too long and have not paid any price for their inability to perform what is considered a responsibility under the Charter, to prevent such mass atrocities and to ensure peace and security and human dignity. If not to jealously guard the Charter and international law, then they should jealously guard their own resolutions. It's as a result of those resolutions that we had a referral to the ICC, that we have an ICC warrant. And therefore, it is incumbent upon them to enforce their own resolutions and to give them meaningful effect. I think we need a little more naming and shaming going on. I think the reputational damage that can be done to their failures will hopefully achieve a little greater action.
Great, thank you, Mona. Dr. Kapila?
Yeah, well, I think you wanted strategic recommendations, and I think some have been said. I'd kind of like to suggest three kind of on a different track, a complementary track. Firstly, I think there needs to be more advocacy and some kind of continued international advocacy to urge governments not to normalize relations with Sudan too fast. this is a tricky one. On one hand, to reward the reforms and the positive directions in which the country is heading, and on the other hand, not to just let it off the hook for not honoring its commitments. And in my view, the very minimum requirement of any government with whom you might have a normal relation would be that they hand over the indictees to the ICC, the ones that are indicted. It's a kind of benchmark test, if you like. So that's on the diplomatic side. The second recommendation is that we've got to keep on helping the government in its transition. I mean, the fact is that there are good people in the government, but there are an awful lot of bad people who are part of the government as well, including those with a very, very checkered and if not nasty history. And there are also lessons to learn from where the Iraq business went wrong in terms of the Iraq democratic transition. So continuing helping the democratization of the governance of Sudan, to make it more representative. And that includes, obviously, the security side, which is quite a specialized area. But that would be a theme of work that requires strategic direction. Third would be, I'm very sorry, dear friends and justice people and wonderful barristers and lawyers. Fantastic, carry on and all behind you. But I'm really sorry, but I really think we need a preemptive compensation mechanism already. We know there's enough evidence that some class acts of crimes against humanity were committed in the territory of Darfur and Nuba Mountains and elsewhere. Now, so on the basis of that, the Security Council passed a resolution, referred to the ICC, and those indictments were issued. Now, I'm just wondering whether this is pie in the sky strategic thinking, or to say, let us assume that justice will take its course, and let it take its course wherever it takes us. And a person is still innocent until judged guilty through a legal process. Meanwhile, prima facie, there are class crimes being committed on a class of people. So, without necessarily making the ultimate judgment on blame or shame, or that is a matter for the courts to decide, whichever court mechanism decide. Is there not something that can be done? Should we not be working on, should there not be some advocacy on that to see if we can bring some compensation and redress, even as the world moves on and takes 2 steps forward or 1 step back? And for example, my iron test, my benchmark test is, can we reverse at least those components of the ethnic cleansing that can be reversed? For example, in repopulating Darfur by enabling the original population of Darfur to return to their original homes, wherever they are, outside the country or inside the country, and enabling that to happen without prejudice to anything else, without prejudging anything else, but to try and reverse the ethnic cleansing, if you can call it that, you see. And that it requires some mechanism or some advocacy or some fund or something like that. Finally, I would recommend, I've had a number of approaches in recent days, strangely enough, about creating some kind of a memorial or documentation, not documentation center alone, but some sort of memorial or, maybe based on the Kigali Genocide Memorial, the Rwanda thing, or maybe on the Holocaust Memorial, of which there are many examples, etc., etc. Obviously, this should be in the Sudan and not somewhere else. We don't need it in London or Washington or something. But while we are doing that, I can imagine in this digital age, trying to construct a kind of digital memorial, and certainly keeping the documentation safe and all the rest of it, but also creating a digital memorial that one day might form have a physical incarnation inside Sudan when the timing is right. That's me done.
Thank you so much, Mukesh. Thank you for all of our speakers spoke about everything. One thing I wanted to recommend is to reorient the Sudanese laws to meet the international standards. There is no definition of rape in the Sudanese laws. There is no war crimes or crimes against humanity. The government has taken those. So we need to have law in place to speak about, like, whether we need to have a hybrid or how we are going to bring justice in the future or try other people out of the 4 or 5 indictees ICC indexes. That's very important. Reforming institution, security sector reform, as mentioned by Ambassador Stephen Rapp, it's very, very important to do so before, like, if there's no law in Sudan, pressuring Sudan and also making it attractive for both, like empowering the civil society to speak and pressure the government, but also Sudan's friends from outside and those who want to normalize with Sudan, for Sudan to join the ICC. Because I saw that how ICC, in some way, it's not an ideal situation, but in the case of Kenya, the ICC has been domesticated and integrated into the Kenyan constitution. So even though the president of Kenya, like, they did whatever they do to suppress the witnesses, but he showed up to the ICC, because if he couldn't, then he will be violating the Kenyan national laws and constitution. And by then he will be disqualifying himself from being president. So we want to see that kind of example. And I also want the road to justice in Darfur not to exclude, but to be a road to justice for other Sudanese who have suffered from Bashir or previous military regimes. But if we fail Darfur, then we would be failing the people of Sudan. And pursuing justice not only just for punishment, but also establishing a prevention measures, because I want to show the Sudanese people that if they disagree, if they fight, that there is a court for them to go. They don't need to pick gun and fight. It's just people tired of being killed for no reason. And that's something that is really, really, really important for us to see happen. And then women, bringing women to the center of every decision making. And if any government wants to normalize with the government of Sudan, they have to bring women. The interim government have failed us on our expectation. They're only 10% of women representation right now in government. And without women being in the table, I don't see that women would have justice, whether internationally or nationally. And that's very important to pursue justice for crimes committed in Darfur. So thank you so much. I know it's hard for us to stop joking, but it's been an incredible afternoon to have such outstanding, committed, dedicated individual to be with us here today. And the people of Darfur are lucky to have you in their life. And I am the one who's lucky to have you, because it's really hard to drag your feet every day when what you wake up to is someone killed and someone bleeding, even for those who ran away to the neighboring country are continue to be killed and are vulnerable and living in bad condition. But when you know that you have people who have your back, people that you can call on and they can respond, people that come to you and say, we want to help, here we are, we want to speak about this, and this is what we can do. And that is what keep me going, and that is what keep our people alive. Like, keeping the hope alive that is the psychological survival that keep our people in camps alive. And I can't thank you enough, but my promise is, as long as I'm alive, I want to show you a day will come that we can live up to your confidence, to give you a free Sudan and a free Darfur, where simply, as Mukesh perfectly stated, that those who in Chad or inside Darfur go back just to their land under the shade of their trees or mountains or anything. That day where you all can come down and be appreciated and thanked by the people of Darfur, not myself. Thank you. And have a great afternoon.
Thank you, Niemat. Best of luck.